This video is sponsored by Nebula. Please stay tuned to the end of the video to find out more about how you can sign up for Nebula so you can see my new short film, Talking to White People, which will only be available on Nebula. Now on to the show.
The first color on this flag is red for a reason. It's the blood that makes you African, so I would never mistreat a mixed race African.
Robert Clark and Amos Wilson and some of those names I haven't heard up until I started engaging more of these politics that were to the left, that were more African-centered.
Them Hoteps, oh, they the worst. They say the shit so nice to you hypothetically, respectfully. If you slept with me genetically.
Black women went wrong because we don't know how to just lay up under a nigga. It's like they make a modicum of sense and then they just kind of take you into the other direction.
Struggle is up, brother. Oppression is up, brother. Salami, eggs, and bacon.
But we'd hate to think the devaluing of black life and brutality against black people is just the status quo. It's a day at work.
I will never say that progress is being made. If you stick a knife in my back 9 inches and pull it out 6 inches, there's no progress. If you pull it all the way out, that's not progress. The progress is healing the wound that's a blow made. And they haven't even begun to pull a knife out.
It's hard to make sense of the topic of what is or is not a Hotep. To try to make sense of the topic of Hoteps as we understand the term today takes a lot of explaining, hence the length of this video. This pejorative term for a specific type of pro-black caricature has mutated to describe a lot of people and a lot of ideologies. Too many, in fact, to the point where the word, I'm realizing, doesn't mean anything and means everything at the same time. There are a lot of different characters in the story of how the word Hotep, which is an Egyptian word for peace, became a term used to describe everyone from Louis Farrakhan to Umar Johnson to even me, which is one of the reasons why I realized this video had to be made at this point. But for the sake of not making a long video longer, I'm going to start with a man named Ronald Everett, better known as Ron or Maulana Karenga, and his role in the assassination of a Black Panther in 1969.
We're starting to see the first, I think, the advent of more and more violence in this country by revolutionaries.
We are the people's workers, and we're going to keep serving the people. We're saying power to all the people.
Which he defends most militantly as a Black Panther outspokenly engaged in revolutionary activity.
In 1969, Al Prentice Bunchy Carter formed a Southern California chapter of the Black Panther Party. The Panthers at the time had grown to pretty significant prominence in Black circles, especially in urban centers, as the civil rights movement of the previous 10, 15 years had lost a lot of steam and a lot of financial support, along with favor among Black people, as there was a growing sense of radicalism in Black America.
You're gonna sit in front of your television set and listen to LBJ tell you that violence never accomplishes anything, my fellow Americans. But you see, the real problem with violence is that we have never been violent. We have been too nonviolent.
As such, the Black Panthers were different than what people had seen up until this point. Most significantly, the Black Panthers were an explicitly leftist socialist organization, something that's constantly left out of mainstream depictions of the Black Panthers. Further, they kind of left the whole nonviolence thing in the background. They trained in various forms of self-defense. But true to that leftist philosophy, they made a lot of efforts in community organizing and education and engagement, providing childcare and free schooling for inner-city Black residents wherever a chapter existed. Their complex organizing principles, leftist ideology, and willingness to defend themselves with violence made them highly targeted by the American government, with then FBI Director J. Edgar Hoover calling them a threat to American security and pouring massive resources into destroying the Panthers and any other forms of Black radicalism. And that's because the Panthers were just one group in the late 60s organizing around what's often called the Black Power movement, which is an overall movement focusing on a reimagining of what it meant to be Black in America, as well as recognizing that direct action and more confrontation with the system was necessary to free Black people. And this at times brought them into conflict not just with the system, but with each other.
Difficult for me to use the phrase black power because of the connotative meaning that it has for many people.
And one such incident was a conflict between Ron Karenga and his organization Organizing Us and Bunchy Carter of the Black Panthers in Southern California in the late 60s. The Panthers were, as I said, black radicals, greatly focused on class struggle and agitating for direct resistance to the current state of oppression for black people.
Are you saying that you can change it with the vote now instead of with the guns?
We're saying, like Malcolm X said, the ballot or the bullet.
But they were not anti-working with other groups, as illustrated with Fred Hampton's Rainbow Coalition, where he organized with the white and Latino people.
What we're saying is that there are white people in the mother country that are for the same types of things that we are for stimulating revolution in the mother country. And we said that we work with anybody and form coalition with anybody that has revolution on their mind.
Karenga, however, had the belief that black people were at their core Africans and should create their own culture and sense of nationalism within America, greatly apart from the general white society.
Some people were trying to make alliances with their enemy and at the same time had no power to make an alliance. You cannot make an alliance if you have no power and someone else has all the power.
There was a championing of lost African traditions and a strong sense of community building internally and excluding everyone else. Not just in terms of space, but also identity and culture, even language. Many Afrocentrists under Karenga got rid of their American names and adopted Swahili or African names.
Why is it important for black people to have a mythology? It is important because black people have to have, as everybody else, a starting point. You just can't spring up in Mississippi, Alabama, and Georgia like Topsy. You got to start from somebody. You got to start from somewhere. And you got to, in terms of starting like that, be what? A chosen people. Everybody's mythology on this planet makes them a chosen people, except Double O Soul.
Karenga, however, was a believer in what would eventually become Afrocentricity or Afro-cultural nationalism. Though for reasons that will be explained later, both of those terms aren't perfect descriptors for the various schools of thought and movements that are often labeled as such. There wasn't the same sense of class struggle, as this particular movement was most prominent with college-educated, upperly mobile black people, and there was little effort in the way of direct resistance to the system like the Panthers are doing. And this was the core of the conflict between these two groups. The Panthers saw the US organization as a half measure, a compromise with capitalism, fascism, and white supremacy, unwilling to directly resist those forces in the name of black liberation.
Negroes have to put Negroes to work. See, you run into a major contradiction. If you have capitalism, even if it happens to be black capitalism, you have to have a people to exploit. Now, we're about saying that the masses of black people should be in control of what is theirs, which means that they cannot be exploited anymore, which means that simply, by the needs of the people, we must destroy capitalism.
On the other hand, us saw the Panthers as reckless and unorganized and incapable of actually having a real lasting impact.
They used to have nonviolence and integration. Now they got violence and integration. It's the same thing. It's the same cardboard Murphy game, the P game that every nigga should be hip to by now.
And there's angles and arguments one can make on behalf of either particular opinion.
Anybody that goes for that is a chump.
But in the end, it wasn't a battle of ideas that ended this feud and decided the future of black political thought.
A 450-year-old chump. So in 1970, we're going to separate all that.
Instead, it was guns.
At the University of California at Los Angeles, 2 Black Panthers were shot to death.
2 of our brothers who were our leaders and who were beautiful, beautiful men were shot down by pigs. And they were not white pigs, and they were not uniform pigs. They were black pigs.
Do you think yesterday's shooting was a deliberate attempt to kill these 2 men, or was it out of an explosive temper?
Somebody from the US organization has slapped her. This is when the Steiner brother supposedly steps out from behind the doors and open fire.
Did you give an order? Did you send...
I did not give an order. I'm not even in town.
The members of the US organization were taken from the crime scene.
It was deliberate. They were on target. Our Deputy Minister of Defense is dead, along with our Minister of Information.
Cleaver said a purge of Black Panther members is tearing the party apart.
The government, power, COINTEL, whatever, when they killed Bunchy, they killed the party. We just didn't know it.
It was as ugly a turn of events as one could imagine for 2 groups that, for all intents and purposes, should have been working together. Or was it? See, years later, it was revealed that the CIA's COINTELPRO operation had infiltrated both groups and was purposely fanning the flames of discord. Further, it's strongly believed that Karenga, the ostensible victor in this conflict, being the last one left alive, was actually working with some of these organizations. It has been admitted by the CIA that they persistently worked to infiltrate and destroy Black power groups in the 70s and 60s up until the 80s. They often don't name the names unless people name themselves. However, by his own admission, we do know that Karenga worked with the LAPD and even met with Ronald Reagan after the murder of Martin Luther King in a measure to ensure there'd be no civil unrest in the wake of King's death. These are things Karenga spoke to as the wrong move, and it would color his image in the eyes of many Black American radicals for the foreseeable future to know that he does have some form of relationship and reputation with the same administrative powers that Black people saw as their oppressor.
So I want you to address what I think are the two lingering allegations that have kind of circulated around you over the last 30, 40 years. One concerns the killing of Panther leaders John Huggins Jr. and Bunchy Carter at UCLA on January 17th, 1969. And in fact, someone just put that in the chat and said they heard it.
In terms of bad looks and highly concerning accusations, this isn't as bad as it gets for Karenga, and we'll talk about that later. But what's more significant in the moment is that despite all of this, Karenga has went on to be one of the most influential figures in the aesthetics, at least, of Black nationalism and Afrocentrism. He created the holiday Kwanzaa in the 60s, which reached the height of its popularity in the US in the 90s and 2000s.
These children get a rare opportunity to perform for the person who created the holiday they sing about. Before speaking at Florida A&M University's Black History Convocation, we asked Maulana Karenga to reflect on recent African American history. First, the impact of Kwanzaa 46 years after he started it all.
And this also promoted the language of Swahili in the process, which also helped popularize the abandoning of slave names by Black Americans. Now, of course, he wasn't the first or only person to do a lot of these things, but he is one of the most prominent and the originators of it. And I know for me and my upbringing in Afrocentric circles in Chicago, Karenga was a name I heard a lot. And in that regard, when you take a critical look at all the things that Karenga's career is attached to, he is probably the most important influence on what we might call today a Hotep, for better and definitely for worse. The concept of what a Hotep is a topic that I and others have avoided because in some ways it's transgressive for me to speak on it, and let's just say mixed company. I'll hit 1 million subscribers by the end of this year. This ain't all niggas. I love all of y'all that watch me. I appreciate all my supporters, but certain times, certain conversations don't feel like they're appropriate for certain viewers. And while I've always talked about Black politics and issues, I've avoided those topics on purpose because I feel like in a lot of situations, they'll either do more harm than good or just be really annoying to have to explain from square one to people that even if I explain it as best I can, it's gonna be really hard for them to understand. Further, I realized that I'm not just a normal guy on YouTube, I'm an influencer now. People are influenced by the things I say. I've watched TikTok and even normal TV more than a few times now and felt like I was hearing people directly quote things I've said in videos. So talking about some real deep lore shit within Black culture and Black political thought could be seen as not being on code, and it's irresponsible to spread Black business like this. However, I think that's also maybe a cop-out on my part, an easy position to take to mask my own flawed understanding and relationship with this term as it has been popularly used for more than a decade. Because what's become apparent in this last decade or so as this term has been used, while it's been fun and funny to criticize and ridicule the likes of Umar Johnson, Tariq Nasheed, and maybe even Kanye West and Kyrie Irving, the absence of a real understanding of the term's pejorative use and its history has also been instrumental in mocking and dismissing Black radical thought as a whole from the likes of John Enright Clark, Kwame Ture, and Frantz Fanon.
Pan-Africanism is very difficult for us to deal with because the enemy has done so much to hide Pan-Africanism. I mean, if you take a man like Frantz Fanon, how many of you heard of Frantz Fanon? You'll hear a lot about Frantz Fanon, but you'll never read that Frantz Fanon is a Pan-Africanist. He's a revolutionary, he fought here, he fought there, he did this with the French Communist Party, but no way will they call him a Pan-Africanist. And Frantz Fanon is a sterling example of Pan-Africanism.
And as I said, it's a term that's used to dismiss me at times, along with my evil nemesis, Lil Bill, who's also making a video on the topic that you all need to watch. What started out as an insular joke and meme for Black culture suddenly became a term used to dismiss any form of pro-Black radical thought, or just pro-Black thought at times, by people who would rather not engage with what's being said. And while I've never taken the accusation of being a Hotep seriously, I've had to come to terms with the fact that this comparison is happening in part because there's been a significant effort to flatten, mock, and dismiss all of that radical thought that informs my political analysis. And it's probably time something significant was done about that. So that's what this video is. Bill's video, which again you should watch after you finish this one, will go over the long history of Black political thought and cultural events that often get grouped into being Hotep, along with discussing how the bastardization of these politics is greatly an internal problem. He's going all the way back to the Civil War, believe it or not. Yes, the shit goes that deep. But for this video, I'm going to spend more time examining the modern phenomenon of how the term stops being a specific greeting between certain people and certain cultures that are insular and significant in their own right, to being something we use to mock goofy guys online that wear ox and think you shouldn't eat corn. What created the atmosphere for this distortion? Who is most responsible for it? And what unforeseen consequences have occurred because of it?
We have to look at the concept of Hotep from three players in this. The people who are identified as Hoteps, their supporters, and their detractors. They all play a very significant role, and the vast majority of them are full of it.
When we spoke about what even would this conversation be, I did say, like, you know, I'm not that familiar with the politic of it, like the ideology of it. To the point of the mockery, it has become a caricature, but it has become a caricature because of what you named, the reactionary aspects of it, right? So people don't even acknowledge what it means. I remember seeing Dr. Gregory Carr on Twitter kind of like erupt in a sort of like passionate like pushback around the ways that it just took off and the flattening of Hotep and the way that it became a pejorative in a sense, right? It became a slur to call someone a Hotep, and it also became a way to dismiss something that was easily said.
That kind of turned me off to like the whole college educated, like the Black bourgeois Pan-Africanist type of, because in my mind it's like, you know, I grew up with this. And it turned me off to just straight up, you know, Pan-Africanism or just straight up Black nationalism, because it was either two groups of people it was either two extremes. It was either the people, you know, who went 10 toes down into what I grew up with, which I knew, and I saw all of the goofery that was going on with that, or it was the people on the complete other side that was like, oh, okay, well, the streets don't got nothing substantive to contribute because it's the streets. And so here I am somewhere in the middle trying to rectify, you know, class conscious and race consciousness at the same time.
Africana studies comes out of this movement. Black studies comes out of this movement. Some Africana studies stuff does in earnest, with integrity, make it into the online space. But I think it very quickly, once you realize about like going viral and building an audience, it very quickly gets taken over.
Oh, hello again. You may remember me as the unwitting narrator in Feek's last deeply complex video about Black issues in America. A video I was both ill-suited for and deeply uncomfortable doing. But as recompense, Feek has invited me back to host a video that he assures me will be a far more appropriate fit for a YouTuber who specializes in anime, pro wrestling, and video games. So, part 1. What exactly is Hotep anyway? Wait, what is Hotep?
Well, I know a lot of you already know what a Hotep is. I also know that there's going to be a lot of people watching this, including a lot of Black folks, that don't really know this term or where it came from. The term Hotep originally comes from the Egyptian language, and it means I come in peace. It was a greeting popularized by Afrocentrist communities in the US probably since the 80s. However, around the 2010s, the term became more properly used as a pejorative to describe a certain type of guy or sometimes girl in online and Black spaces. A short, easy definition is that a Hotep is a person who employs pro-Black or Afrocentric aesthetics and talking points, often to promote what are actually conservative or right-wing opinions. But another definition might also just say that a Hotep is a person whose engagement with Afrocentric and pro-Black aesthetics and rhetoric borders on the bizarre and the buffoonish. I would argue that it's a spectrum of sorts. A Hotep might just really be into New Age thinking or pro-black politics to the point where they become a bit too strange even for other pro-blacks. Or they might be talking about homosexuality being a plot by Jewish bankers to destroy the black family. Or they just might be trying to say that if women stopped eating corn, they wouldn't have a menstrual cycle. This all may sound made up, but it isn't. And the fact that it's a spectrum is kind of part of the problem. There's not a perfect example or definition of being a Hotep. But internally, black communities kind of know it when they see it, which is why people were confused when I say Kendrick Lamar could be called a Hotep. While Kendrick Lamar doesn't seem to have the regressive politics and super Afrocentric aesthetics that we sometimes attach to Hoteps, if you listen to his lyrics and you're familiar with the concepts and imagery of Afrocentrism and Pan-Africanism, you recognize that there are a lot of influences there. Kendrick has referred to himself on record as an Israelite. It indicates that members of his family were Black Hebrew Israelites. Now, Hebrew Israelites are not Afrocentric, actually. In fact, they tend to be very anti-African. But some of the problematic elements of the Israelites' cult-like behavior and leaders, anti-Semitism, homophobia, and general loudmouth buffoonery are all signifiers of what many might call a Hotep. For the record, though it's clear that some influences in Kendrick music are there, I don't actually think Kendrick is an Israelite for you hardcore fans in the audience that's going to focus on this in the comment section. But Kendrick's association with the concept of Hotep is actually a good starting point on why it's such a challenge to talk about it with some form of accuracy. Afrocentrism and alternative black thought has traced influences on so many things in black culture, from hip hop to art to fashion. And if all you know about black culture is that this also is what Hoteps look like, you'd be prone to see much of this stuff in a negative light. At the same time, the worst parts of Hotep ideology often get the most attention, especially when social media gets involved.
We're not gonna talk about Uncle Shannon Sharp. I heard he got caught on the live banging out a snow bunny. We're not gonna talk about Uncle Shannon Sharp. I heard he got caught on the live banging out a snow bunny. We're not gonna talk about Uncle Shannon Sharp being snow bunnied on Instagram Live. We're not gonna laugh at our brother.
So at my age, I'm 38 now, my age, it's about 7.5 days between ejaculation to maintain who I am.
Really?
Yeah. And
damn.
Yeah. So a man's strength is his balls, right? Right. So every time you deplete yourself, you're not the same man anymore. You lose your superpowers.
I knew I was going to eventually have to speak on the issue of what a Hotep is a few years ago when Kanye West and Kyrie Irving started getting a lot of attention for some ridiculous statements they were making, much of which was steeped in weird conspiracy theories and anti-Semitism, two very common elements of what we began to think of as Hoteps in the 2010s.
He's been locked out of his Twitter account now, the platform suspending him after an anti-Semitic tweet. That tweet said, quote, "When I wake up, I'm going DEFCON 3 on Jewish people." His tweet continued saying, quote, "The funny thing is I actually can't be anti-Semitic because black people are actually Jew."
Black folks since then and well beforehand had heard all of the nonsense they were spewing. We had heard it for years, maybe even generations, and it was nothing to brush it off. But these are not just, guys in your barbershop or in your local area. These are international superstars with giant audiences.
To follow up on the promotion of the movie and the book.
Can you please stop calling it a promotion? What am I promoting?
Put it out on your platform.
But I'm promoting it? Do you see me in front of
putting it out there, people are going to say that you are promoting.
Put it out there just like you put things out there, right?
So suddenly this ideology, this frame of thought was in mainstream discourse, and it was in mainstream discourse among white people.
What did you make of his response, Nick?
It was very Kyrie-like. Having been around him now and covered him for a year, he doesn't want to say anything that he doesn't fully believe on. And when he gets pushed, he wants to make sure that he is in control. And it was so clear, guys. All he had to say was, I don't have any anti-Semitic views. That was what the Nets wanted to hear. That is certainly what the NBA wanted to hear. And it didn't happen because he always makes things more difficult than they have to be.
And amongst certain types of politically inclined white folks, there was suddenly a cry for the denouncement of Kanye and Kyrie, along with the expectation of condemning the perceived Hotep, quasi-black supremacists of black political thought as a whole that these guys somehow represented, which of course they did not. These voices came from a lot of spaces, but I want to focus on an old horse-loving nemesis who always pays his taxes on time, Vosh.
And I will be
the most obnoxiously white debate bro anti-Hotep person in the universe, okay? I will single-handedly worsen race relations by watching all of this and giving my 14-year-old white followers the impression that a lot of black people are like this.
Did you guys know that black nationalist terrorist attacks are actually pretty common in the United States? They're called black separatist, I think.
Don't get me wrong, under most circumstances, if a black guy died, if a black fake lefty died and the cops were there, I'd blame the cops. But this is one of those rare situations where the cops are actually the more trustworthy people in this environment.
Vaush is an influential leftist political streamer with over 500,000 subscribers at this time of recording. And over the course of several years, at least the years that I paid attention to Vaush, has made talking about Hoteps a recurring part of his content.
And I want your white listeners to understand. Because people be trying to say stuff like, he's the black Hitler. I'm not the black Hitler.
I love saying that.
I am in no way interested in hurting or
I love saying that about black people. I'll say that about any black people, honestly.
And this isn't difficult because the cartoonist images of black radicalism like Umar Johnson and Tariq Nasheed were everywhere.
If you get pregnant by a man over 50, the baby will come out already 50 years old.
I know a lot of women who have high emotional IQs who don't get caught up in the petty back and forth.
Yes, sir.
Either.
Yes, sir.
Yeah.
But normally, more often than not, it's supposed to be the male.
Mm-hmm.
Sometimes the woman does have that, which is good, but that also speaks to the fact that the women are becoming more masculinized.
I like what you're doing, Dr. Umar. Beautiful black skin. Juicy J, are you a male or female? Juicy J, thank you for the $5. Are you a male or female?
Why do you need white man paperwork?
Oh my God, we've got so much to tear into.
And Vaush had gotten very comfortable comparing black nationalism to white nationalism, despite many people trying to calmly explain him the vast difference and how that makes him look a certain way.
I do think that part of the problem is that you've been exposed to the absolute worst elements of this quote ideology, and the people that you've spoken to have happened to be the like Farrakhan end of the spectrum.
I think that is the ideology. I mean, you're literally describing both the historical and the modern foundations of black separatism.
He would consistently contribute to an atmosphere that basically put the nonsensical Hotep stuff that was popular on the internet and memes and Twitter in the same category as real black radical thought, which was obviously a problem for anyone that tried to engage with this online. As frustrated as I was with Vaush's behavior at this time, what's become clear since then is that what he was doing was really just indicative of a lack of knowledge and ignorance towards these topics by pretty much anyone in the political sphere, black, white, leftist, liberal, obviously conservatives, etc.
The reason why black power seems as if it's out of control, and it seems as if they are too rebellious. They are gun-toting, angry black militants who are practicing politics without portfolio, and black power is the civil rights movement's ruthless twin. The reason it seems that way is because black power advocates were willing to speak truth to power and say that the entire system, going back to racial slavery, Stokely said this, Malcolm X said this, Angela Davis said this, Kathleen Cleaver said this, both black power activists who were men and women, but Young Lord said this, Chicano activists said it, the black feminists of the Third World Women's Alliance and the Combahee River Collective and the National Black Feminist Organization said this. This went against a liberal perspective that if it was broken, it could be fixed. It went against civil rights perspectives that said, if we have enough laws and legislation, things can be fixed. It didn't mean that people didn't want new laws and legislations. So what black power activists often did is they straddled both fences.
No one really has a good knowledge base or understanding of these areas of study, which is unfortunate because this is a really important part of leftist history and the political imagination that we probably need to have right now. Black radical movements are varied and complex, and even I am just now learning to understand them to a decent level. And yes, some aspects of black nationalism, Afrocentrism, and Pan-Africanism are attributed to weird guys like Umar Johnson and Hotep Jesus. But while it would be easy to point to the likes of Vaush and his ilk as the main culprits of this, what has to be engaged with is that I and folks like me over the last 15, 20 years are very much a part of that same problem. See, the truth is that people like Vosh are greatly just repeating things they've heard and witnessed from black social media circles on Twitter, YouTube, and Facebook. He probably only knows Umar Johnson because of a Breakfast Club interview that Umar Johnson did.
Let me ask you a question, Dr. Umar. Are you totally against interracial relationships?
I am totally against it, and I want to make sure you understand why. It's not because... Cut it out, Envy. Cut it out, Envy.
Don't do that, Envy.
Why aren't more white people tearing into this guy? Are you really that scared? It is, isn't it? Guys, I bet you a ton of people of color in my audience knew who the fuck this guy was because he's irrelevant. No, he ain't. No, he's not. That video of him on the podcast from earlier this year we looked at had like 250,000 views. He's not irrelevant at all.
The Breakfast Club interview only happened because Umar Johnson, since the 2010s, had become incredibly popular, not necessarily for being a serious political figure in black culture, but for this bombastic, cartoonish image that he created for social media content. And that content only became popular because it found an audience both of supporters who believed his message, but also from detractors who clowned him and made him into a meme.
Special guest in the building this morning.
A very polarizing figure.
Dr. Umar Johnson.
Dr. Umar Johnson. What's up, my brother?
Good morning, Thanks for having me. It's an honor to be here.
But even that memification has a root in black cultural history from black spaces over the last 20, 30 years. And that criticism is both warranted and unwarranted.
While I was in school learning about, King and George Washington Carver and all that other stuff, I was at home being taught I was learning about Kwame at home. I was learning about, I didn't really want to hear it, but I was learning about Huey and all of them. So by the time I got home, I'm like, this is old news to me. For me, it was like a spectrum, right? Because it's like on one end, you got Damon Wayans, and then on the other end, you got like Huey Freeman, right? And for me growing up, they both Hoteps. Both of them.
It doesn't take much looking through black media to recognize that the image of the Hotep has been consistently mocked and rejected. But this mockery hasn't been without unforeseen consequences. Characters like Oswald Bates from In Living Color are memorable staples of this caricature, but he was not rare. There's Shazad from A Different World, who has some of the usual modern Hotep talking points. There's the black revolutionary character from I'm Gonna Get You Sucker.
The brothers weren't bad anymore. Yes. Whitey is something else. Damn.
My great Nubian warrior. Dinner's ready.
We have a guest. Meet my old Fay wench.
But it's not just TV and movies. Alice Walker critiqued the petite bourgeois nature of some Afrocentrists in her short story Everyday Use with the character Hakeem Abarber. You have to read it to make sense of that name.
You can call me Hakeem Abarber. A what? Hakeem Abarber. Barber.
The real emergence of the term Hotep as a pejorative doesn't happen in the last 5-6 years online and on YouTube. It happens in black social media circles in the 2010s. And yes, this is around when people like Umar Johnson begin to gain notoriety as public figures. While Umar today has very much been memified and cleaned up his image to allow him more reach and access to mainstream media, earlier he was seen in a more serious light, which was also much more openly reactionary with much more bizarre and harmful rhetoric coming out of his mouth on a regular basis.
There was an article that came out about 3 weeks ago. They said for the first time in Black America, teenage pregnancy is down. For the first time in about 40 years since Dr. King's assassination. And they're scrambling to find out why. I know exactly why it's down. It's down because the birth control that you give most of the young black teenagers is designed to prevent them from ovulating ever again. The Noraplant and the pills that they're giving them, it's messing them up. And then on top of that, you have your highest number of black gay males of all time, and your highest number of black lesbian females of all time. So if you can convince, as Barack Obama so excellently did, convince black boys to date each other and convince black girls to date each other, there can be no conception. So part of the whole push for homosexuality in the first place was to reduce the numbers.
And Umar wasn't alone. He was joined by figures like Boyce Watkins and Tariq Nasheed, who began spouting overtly right-wing rhetoric but scribbled over with black nationalist aesthetics. Nasheed even had a highly successful series of documentaries called Hidden Colors that managed to gain tons of attention and admiration despite being full of misogyny and homophobic conspiracy theories.
If we want the youth to watch what we have to say and hear what we have to say when we make these films, we have to have the quality correct. We have to be competitive. And another mistake that we make is to do something and say, okay, it's black, support it. But yeah, I love Tyler Perry. I love that brother, and I respect what he does. He started his own studio, which I take my hat off to. And people criticize that brother unjustly. I don't like the criticism of him because Tyler, he employs a lot of black people. He practices
on the
group
internet.
economics.
Hotep was being thrown around as a derogatory pretty firmly. Like this is the age of Very Smart Brothers blog being very popular. We're kind of getting like different sort of archetypes for black men in the 21st century.
Right.
But we also then have a Tariq Nasheed and Hidden Colors, which at that time is actually very popular amongst like black frat men. So like Omega Sci-Fi and Alpha Phi Alpha chapters are like showing, like a lot of college educated black men are watching Hidden Colors. I mean, like, wow, my mind is profoundly changed. And that is scary. That is, for a multitude of reasons, scary. And I found out that Tariq Nasheed still has a decent fan base.
He does. I hesitated to talk about Tariq Nasheed because where their fans will stalk you. My first stalkers were Tariq Nasheed fans.
Here's the ironic thing about Hoteps, which is an African-centered black conscious greeting. What's ironic about that is many of the Hoteps espouse right-wing Western white positions.
Yeah.
And, you know, I once said it should be howdy do or howdy instead of Hotep because Dr. Fubar, I don't know if you're familiar with Imalamu Baruti, many of their assertions and positions and what they advocate for align perfectly with focus on the family. Mm-hmm. Much of it aligns with Oath Keepers and other right-wing, what they advocate as solutions, the role of the black man, the role of the black woman,
family,
scapegoating, single mothers, scapegoating, LGBTQ plus people.
Polygamy.
So, but yes, rhetoric of the average so-called Hotep, the Afrocentric militant, I hate white devils militant, what they advocate for comes straight out of white chauvinistic patriarchal society.
Those were just the top tier heavy hitters because tons of other smaller scale Hotep creators and spaces began to get tons of attention and traction. And you'd have to do some deep lore research and investigation to find the old message boards and the Facebook groups that were full of Hoteps. My favorite figure on the small scale is Yada, now known as Yada Awakening.
First, European doctrine was written off European women. Their philosophy when it came to the menstrual cycle was written off the European woman, not the African. Their ancestors was not running around. They were not running around bleeding all over the place. No, why? Because they ate natural food.
Who, unlike most of the people from that time, is still around today, though now he's a biochemist somehow.
I've created a herbal compound that they have been using for the past 30 days, and they're bragging to everybody about how their memory, how their mind is sharper, how they think clearer, they don't have no brain fogs. I have perfected a herbal compound.
I could go on. Like, the Hotep content creator hole is incredibly deep. But I fear bringing more attention to the more goofy parts of these spaces just because that would defeat the whole point of this video. That's the problem we have right now. This rise in Hotep's presence on social media is also when people start understanding how social media really works as a commercial industry. We understand what goes viral and how to get things to go viral through rage bait. We also see the rise of the black manosphere in figures like Tommy Sotomayor. You start to see Lord Jamar pop up on DJ Vlad's couch. It's a gold rush of mess at this point. So everywhere there are these mostly men and sometimes even women saying the most ridiculous things and calling it pro-black. And the outrage engendered by that nonsense gets people to share the content that they hate.
I got 20,000 memes, you better Gibson. So I got on TikTok because I was forced to because everybody kept saying you need to get on TikTok. And I saw all the fake pages in my name. There's somebody with a 3 million follower page on TikTok called Prince of Pana. And it's nothing but Dr. Umar clips. And TikTok won't transfer over to me, my damn page, with all my... You know what I mean?
So. Well, so with you on social media, you're such a known person. Like, I feel like anytime there's any situation that has to do with an interracial couple or anything interracial, hands down, it's at Dr. Umar. I've done it. Yeah.
Here comes the Undertaker music. What's your opinion on being a meme, man?
Yeah, what do you think about that?
It's a double-edged sword. It's a double-edged sword because I wouldn't be as popular as I am if it weren't for the goofy shit.
Yeah. There was a whole apocalypse of Hotepery going on in the 2010s. And this apocalypse of nonsense elicited a warranted response from black progressives. And in that response, somebody came up with the term Hotep to describe these people. I'm not sure who the first person was to do that, but it stuck and it exploded in popularity among mostly now older Black millennials who pioneered social media during that time period. And many of these Black millennials would have grown up watching In Living Color and Martin and Living Single and would have seen those caricatures of what a Hotep is on TV to easily match them to what they were seeing in the moment on social media.
Oh no.
I can break down the whole world for you right now. Just keep proving them right, brother. As soon as you wake up and realize they're never gonna give it to us.
You got more conspiracy theories than that dude with the hair who believes aliens built the pyramids.
They might have.
You have an obsession with power. You just threw the F word around like you're in England looking for a smoke. Oh no. No.
What?
Trevor, are you a Hotep?
Hotep is Egyptian for peace.
God damn it!
And while it was important to address the problem of that rhetoric growing online, the response to it sometimes was just as reactionary to the reactionary nonsense itself.
And then Dr. Umar Johnson went on like a 45-minute rant against him. That shit is so hilarious, you know. I mean, this fool is going on talking about, you coming for the Prince of Pan-Africanism. That's what he calls himself, the Prince of Pan-Africanism. You coming for the Prince. You the general. You listen to me. I'm the king. I'm royalty. He does say he's the king, by the way, after saying he's the prince. I mean, it's some really weird shit.
Hoteps disguised as revolutionaries, more Malcolm than Martin, the Black Stars on a quest for a tribe of misogyny and third eyes.
It's one of those situations where you engage in anti-Blackness thinking that the anti-Blackness you're engaging in won't boomerang back towards you at some point in time. And that point in time is now in the last few years. I think there was a frustration with some Black intellectuals and political thinkers that they were being seen in the same light as Umar Johnson and Tariq Nasheed. So when the time came to ridicule them to show that they were different, they didn't hold back. But if you're listening to what I'm saying, you see the flaw in that logic.
It's like it was a Trojan horse to dismiss all of the African thought, you know, Black radical thought, like anything.
And I said more than anti-Blackness, right? Because I don't think that people ran away from their Blackness and that. I think it was the African part that really was what people were shying away from. And I think that's what makes the irony profound here, because the misapplication of Hotep as a pejorative, as a slur, it reflects the same kind of microwave thinking it critiques, because it flattens the historical and linguistic concept, and it makes it this shallow stereotype. And it makes it, it just mirrors the same kind of reductive tendencies that it seeks to expose.
Right.
So in hindsight, it was and remains a lazy dismissal, and it underscores how, central Eurocentric paradigms have influenced just even in our internalized critiques within our own communities, because the ways that we are addressing our own histories or avoiding our own histories in these conversation discussions in our identities are just often sort of ridiculed or dismissed outright.
You'll find that in Black-oriented media, any Black militant, Black nationalist, Afrocentric was always played as a buffoon or a con. You'd be hard-pressed to find even The Cosby Show or The Fresh Prince of Bel-Air when they were like, yeah, Carlton's not Black enough to join our group. And you'll find that in the popular media dating back as far as back as I know, even Sanford and Son. And I greatly admire Fred Sanford. Red Fox.
Red Fox.
Take a good look. I look like Red Fox?
I don't know. I've never seen Mr. Fox sickly.
How would you like me to get a mirror so you can see yourself ugly?
And I grew up watching it. But if you look at whenever someone would come in with an afro or African earrings, he had some pretty disparaging comments about it.
Hey, Lamar, what is going on here? You going trick-or-treating? What is this?
A man's home is supposed to reflect his culture.
Well, if you want to reflect my culture, put up a picture of Bill Eckstein and Joe Louis.
Or Martin with the beady beads.
Now what you need to do is go in the back and straighten out those buckshots in the back of your neck.
And so, it has been relentless degradation. And they always put up a Black militant figure up against a Black person who is fully assimilated.
It's you we don't want.
Me? But I did everything.
I cooked, I cleaned, I hand washed the toilets.
Everything your butler does for you. I'm not accepting no prep school, Bel Air bred sellout into my fraternity.
And it turns out the assimilated black person is the true authentic black, the true sincere black that's helping themselves and helping others and guiding others in the right way.
You think I'm a sellout? Why? Because I live in a big house or I dress a certain way? Being black isn't what I'm trying to be, it's what I am. I'm running the same race and jumping the same hurdles you are, so why are you tripping me up? You said we need to stick together, but you don't even know what that means. If you ask me, you're the real sellout. Yeah, that's right, boy.
Not enough was done to isolate the real politics of the philosophies that these people were pulling from versus the nonsense that they were performing to make them go viral. And the reason behind that is probably because a lot of us didn't really know any better. We didn't know those politics to begin with to separate the two. Real black radical imagery and thought has been systematically excluded from popular discourse as well as education, even higher education. If you're not getting a degree in Africana studies somewhere or black studies, you're probably not learning about a lot of the things we're going to talk about today. If you're getting a degree in history or sociology, you'll get a handful of black theory, but it ends there.
We live in a context where we can't even imagine social justice movements winning, right? Because that's what the first thing neoliberalism does is it robs you of your imagination. Stokely and Ella Baker and Fannie Lou Hamer, they were sure they were going to win, okay? They thought that they were going to see it in their lifetime. Kwame Ture, by the time he gets to be an older man, says, well, hell, I'm not going to see it in my lifetime, but my kids and my grandkids are going to see it, right? He thought he was going to win, and by winning, it meant an end to war. It meant an end to poverty. It meant an end to state-sanctioned violence against all these people domestically and internationally. We live in a context now where we've accepted the status quo, right? And we think the civil rights movement and civil rights leaders all have talk shows.
By ridiculing something we really didn't understand, we low-key gave the green light to people like Voss to even further isolate and mock this knowledge.
Holy shit. Here's a 50K like tweet making fun of him. Hold on. Oh my God, we've got so much to tear into. Why the fuck am I only hearing about this guy today? I know I'm white. Why aren't more white people tearing into this guy? Because he's irrelevant? No, he ain't. No, he's not. That video of him on the podcast from earlier this year we looked at had like 250,000 views. He's not irrelevant at all.
And we have to own the fact that we didn't recognize that we were caught up in the same false media depictions of our own history that we often critique others of. Because of us, Hotep became a pejorative and became a catch-all term to dismiss any form of black radicalism. Now, this wasn't everyone, and it wasn't like our creation. We were just participating in something much bigger than us. And there were black folks online pointing out how this would go wrong. Julesy even has an article on this from nearly a decade ago speaking to this problem. But those voices were mostly in the minority, and the term was completely repurposed from being to be at peace to be what it is today. That said, there is a reason why it was very easy for a lot of black people to mock and critique this image of black radicalism. And that didn't start in the 2010s. It didn't even start in the 80s and 90s when a lot of these communities became more popular. And no, it's not all COINTELPRO and media distortion. The criticism of what we see today as Hotep is rooted in a combination of misinformation, but also legitimate awfulness that came from some of these decentralized fringe movements and these schools of thought. And if we're going to address the problem of that term and how it affects us, we have to actually address why that term was in some cases deserving.
He says there are executioners and there are victims. The executioners are self-imposed. The victims begin to fight and agitate for their liberation. When we say black power, some honky said, you mean violence. And then he expects us to say, boss man, we don't mean violence. Later for the honky, later forms. Later forms, later forms.
I just dialed in to tell you all it's gonna be fine. My mind was on hold, but my heart was on the line. And like my hairline, yo, you always on my mind. I dedicate this record to an extra special listener. I'm always playing around, I mess around and then I miss her. I'm in and out of town, but as soon as I touch down, hit the ground and I kiss her. Hey, Mr. DJ, won't you mix the turntable to a twister? Something more than whisper sweet, nothing to a sister. Something to remind her of her missions and militias. I'm here to foot the bill if I don't got the money. I'ma roll my sleeves and do the dishes. Don't wanna throw back like the jersey from the Supersonic. Play me something, nothing too platonic. finer things, designer things, China things, things from Africa. You so good at fucking finding things. You like mahogany, ebony, ivory, diamonds, cobalt, all kinds of shiny things.
Hello? That sure was racial. A fascinating and mildly fear-inducing watch that I, like so many white people, am not entirely sure I should be seeing. Not to worry, I'm sure this next section will be more appropriate for me to hold. Oh, God damn it, come on, man!
This is the most important part of the video. I need everyone to watch at least this part of the video. I would prefer you watch it actually on one speed, because there's no point in me making this video if people don't get the most out of this section, because in this section, I give you the other half of what Hotep became. And if you leave this video only knowing the fuckery of Hotep history and getting some laughs out of the equation, then I failed. So pay the fuck attention. If I see comments asking me questions about stuff that I talked about in this section, I'm gonna be really angry. So I'm about to try my best to explain a concept that's often referred to as Black radical thought or the Black radical tradition. I don't think this is a formal academic term, but it's a concept that if you're involved in any type of political thought or even academia, you know what it is. At the same time, it's hard to say what it is because it's such a big and nebulous concept that some people think certain things fit in that don't. And there's a lot of ways, I'll come back to this again, that I'm probably not going to be the best messenger to explain this just because it's way too big for a YouTube video to feel like you truly understand. But you can't understand the overall concept of what a Hotep is if you haven't engaged with where Hoteps came from in terms of what they imitate. And what they imitate is Black radicalism.
We're making the revolution by educating the people to the fact that they should arm themselves with self-defense. You see, educate them to what the power structure is doing to them, that they've made racism the primary objective that the people have to deal with when we mainly have to deal with capitalism.
When you read stories about difficulties, riots in Omaha or Cleveland or Brooklyn or Chicago or wherever,
I call them rebellions.
they're rebellions. And you see nothing wrong with them?
I think that it is people who are rebelling against a system that has locked them inside tight of ghettos, that exploits and oppresses them, and they have no means of redress to break that system down. It is no different from a colony in Africa who is supposedly free, but her resources are controlled by the mother country. They have to move to a position to control the resources, and having done that, their problems are already solved.
And the means that you will use to achieve all of this?
Any means necessary.
I think it's fair to say that the Black radical tradition tends to be U.S.-centric, but it's a diaspora-wide phenomenon. Many significant contributions to this tradition feature people like C.L.R. James, Frantz Fanon, Sekou Ture, a lot of people coming outside of North America. It's also not explicitly a leftist phenomenon, as many figures within the tradition are not leftist, such as Marcus Garvey or Malcolm X, although I would argue, and I think many others would say, that Malcolm X was trending left before he was assassinated. In fact, his assassination is probably a result of him trending left. At the core of this tradition is the belief that radical revolutionary change is necessary. It's a requirement for Black people from every walk of life, not just Black excellence, Black folks with education and money, but all Black people will never be free unless there's significant radical change, hence the radicalism moniker. And this change won't happen on its own. It won't happen as a result of the status quo or the overarching society recognizing their wrongdoing. How this change happens depends on who you're talking to, but everybody pretty much agrees that it has to happen and Black people have to be the ones to make it happen or it won't happen.
Any policy or any effort on the part of the power structure to share the resources of this country with the oppressed Black people. So therefore, if the Black people must have these resources, then they must take them.
Do you think that some of the things that this establishment is throwing out at you, such as Black capitalism, is
everything
is
the establishment throws out is to protect the interests of the establishment, period.
But you use power. Don't throw, you know, I mean, Black capitalism scares me to death. See, because all I see is Black pawns stepping on top of poor people rather than the the Jews who dominate the ghetto or the Syrians who dominate, or the other minority groups. There's just a shift of power at the base.
Thus, pretty much every school of thought that might be connected to the Black radical tradition, such as Black nationalism, Pan-Africanism, critical race theory maybe, all in some way recognize that the system is inherently anti-Black and that the system itself must be removed for Blackness to thrive. And this is also why some notable figures like a Booker T. Washington or even a Martin Luther King are often not thought of as part of this tradition, because much of their work is seeking to work within the system as it exists in the moment.
I feel that while believing firmly that power is necessary, that it would be difficult for me to use the phrase Black power because of the connotative meaning.
And I would argue this is somewhat unfair to King because his radical inclinations have been greatly erased from his legacy.
Do I sense that it is your feeling that the civil rights movement as a movement has entered a sort of a different stage?
It was easier to integrate public facilities. It was easier to gain the right to vote because it didn't cost the nation anything. And the fact is that we're dealing with issues now that will call for something of a restructuring of the architecture of American society. It's going to cost the nation something.
Further, some figures that you might associate with the Black radical tradition, like a Louis Farrakhan, upon close inspection, maybe don't belong in that category. That's a bit of foreshadowing, by the way. And I talk about both Louis Farrakhan and MLK in other videos. Please watch those for more details on those takes. It's important to understand that all of the different ideologies that might be connected to the Black radical tradition are not necessarily cohesive in all ways. Like most philosophical schools and traditions, things start and then stop. They're tested, they're improved upon, they conflict. This school of thinkers thinks this school of thinkers are a bunch of idiots.
You can't believe that today.
Well, wait a minute. Are we going to deal with what actually happened then, or are we not?
Well, I'm just saying, I just wanted clarification.
Are we not?
Critical race theory is a response to the failures of the civil rights movement. Intersectional feminism is built out of critical race theory, and Afro-pessimism says both of those things don't really work in real life because people just hate Black people. W.E.B. Du Bois and Marcus Garvey are arguably the most prominent figures in all of Black political thought in American history, and they lived at the same time, sometimes worked within the same spaces, and overtly hated each other and talked bad about each other in the papers on a regular basis.
Garvey himself paraded through the streets of Harlem. To the masses, all this was heady. To a man like Du Bois, it was theatrical nonsense.
All its preambles for the purpose of making it known that, again, I am not the perfect messenger, and after watching this video, you will not have the word on this realm of thought. For my white folks watching, a lot of you who like to listen to one Black voice and then call it a day, understand that is not good enough on any topic, but especially not this one. I'm not even giving you the tip of the iceberg, nor can I say with confidence that there's not things I won't get wrong or important things that might end up missing because it's my analysis. This is one of the reasons why I shout out a lot of other voices. I'll be making a playlist of some other videos that engage with the topic. I'll even go ahead and add some books to the description that you might want to check out if you want to learn more. And that goes for everybody. It's not just white people. I'm just saying that the most annoying questions that are going to come in the comment section are going to come from annoying white people who have no clue about any of this. And I do not want anybody white watching this to jump into a Black radical tradition conversation and say, well, FD Signifier said, do not do that to me. Do you know how bad that is? Don't do that to me. If you love me, don't ever mention our relationship. For the sake of this video, I want to focus on three closely related but significantly different schools of thought in the Black radical tradition: Pan-Africanism, Afrocentricity, and Afrocentrism. These things sound alike and look alike on paper and to the untrained eye, but they have some pretty significant differences, and all of those differences, once you understand them, help us understand what a Hotep really is and what a Hotep is not. The main thing that these schools of thought have in common is the belief that all Black people are Africans, and that is a really important aspect of Black liberation worldwide, that we need to reject second-class citizenship status wherever we might be across the diaspora and see Africa as our home and our legacy and our rights. And in doing that, the liberation of ourselves is the liberation of Africa and vice versa. There's a lot of reasons for that, but the core belief is that colonization, slavery, the transatlantic slave trade, the diaspora, as you will, is the core reason why black people worldwide are in the condition that we're in. We are a nationless people that are often trying to adhere to standards, aesthetics, and belief systems that are not native to us as a people. Further, being an African also means having the right to Africa as a continent and a collection of nations, being invested in its sovereignty, recognizing that there's a land involved in that. That experience of colonization and slavery has left scars on not just the bodies, but the minds of black people across the world. And the only way to heal those scars is to reject a Eurocentric worldview and embrace being African. And to be African and see it as our home also legitimizes an understood right to sovereignty, to nationhood. It means land. It means control over Africa's resources by Africans and not China or America, Elon Musk or Elon Musk's dad. The prominence of these belief systems is in part a response to the very natural desire that all assimilated colonized people tend to have to want to imitate their colonizers. Even the first Pan-African Conference, held in 1919, had participants come out of there saying we need to organize, plan, and engage with the world as Europeans, because that will be the best way to improve the lives of Africans on the continent. This was the classic racial uplift goal that, again, many colonized people have. If we just show the white man that we can be just like them, then maybe they will give us human rights and dignity, which, as you know, if you know history, has never worked. And over time, many, especially those within these three schools of thought, saw this not just as impossible, but foolish and self-deluding. So while the Pan-African Conferences started again in the early 1900s, the most relevant elements of this school of thought start to congeal in the 1960s around the Black Power movement. That's when people start to reject their slave name. That's when we start getting Black is beautiful, Black and proud.
A Black consciousness revolution. A revolution that is filling the need for identity and pride by taking the historical negativeness of Black and using it in a strong, positive way. As is the case with many revolutions, this one is being waged by our young Blacks.
That's when you start seeing people champion their African aesthetics. That's when the Afro becomes a thing. There's a clear line of demarcation when you look at the way Black people present themselves from slavery until the 60s. And in the 60s, there's an explosion of Black aesthetics and energy and images. That's where the concept and term pro-Black really starts to become a thing.
Black is beautiful. It's beautiful to be Black. Just like if I was white, I would say white is beautiful. It's beautiful to be white because this is a form of self-love, in my opinion. But I'm speaking just for myself. I can't speak for the whole race, but I think it's beautiful to be yourself.
We've always been beautiful, but it's just that people are now discovering it, if that makes any sense. Like, we've always known, but people all over the world are beginning to really dig what it's all about now, and they've stopped suppressing us and they're letting us go.
There's a reactionary desire to see this as a form of self-segregation and reverse racism. But the reality is the coordination of resources and the collective identity of ethnic groups, especially immigrant groups in America, has been a core ingredient to the progress of pretty much every immigrant group in America, including white people who didn't exist before. That's another video. And this has been a core ingredient to the advancement of pretty much every immigrant group in American history. No minority group throughout American history has built itself up as a subsidiary of white culture. Even white minorities, groups like the Irish, Italians, or Germans, built themselves up first by creating a unified culture in urban enclaves in the 1900s. This has never been allowed to happen for Black people in America due to the discouragement of self-segregation, or more commonly, whenever self-segregation happens, when Black people built up their own towns and cities and cultures and spaces, they were often the target of white terrorism or state intervention. See Rosewood, Tulsa, redlining, the urban planning of Robert Moses, etc. So to rectify this, these schools of thought are overtly pro-Black, anti-Eurocentric, nationalistic, and seek to collect Black people under a shared African heritage. Thinkers like Garvey, Du Bois, Malcolm X, Fanon, Ella Baker, and so many more are influential foundational figures of all three of these schools of thought. However, while these broad strokes of rejecting European-centric belief systems and framings of the world and championing African culture and community are similar, there are a lot of very important differences. First, let's talk about Pan-Africanism, often referred to as revolutionary Pan-Africanism, for the sole purpose of distinguishing itself from other belief systems, and you'll understand why that is in a moment. I'm going to put my cards out on the table here. This is the best of the three. by far. And if you pay attention to my content, you'll probably see that this is where I stand, because much of my research and experience just shows me that this tradition is the most solid, like ideologically, and has more value than the other two for a variety of reasons. First and foremost, it's clear that white Western power structures historically have seen this particular school of Pan-Africanism as the most serious threat to the system. While many black leaders throughout American and world history have been targeted by white supremacy in various ways, folks most aligned or influential to Pan-African thinking were often the most ruthlessly targeted of the bunch. People like Fred Hampton, Patrice Lumumba, and Thomas Sankara were all assassinated. Fred Hampton by the Chicago police with support from the FBI.
The immediate, violent, criminal reaction of the occupants in shooting at announced police officers emphasizes the extreme viciousness of the Black Panther Party.
Ed Hanrahan, who was the political heir apparent of Mayor Daley, wanted to take credit for having killed this Black Panther leader. So he went on television, and he went on television explaining how Fred Hampton had come out of his bedroom firing a pistol, and how all the Panthers inside had repeatedly broken ceasefires and repeatedly fired at the police. The problem is when you fire a bullet, two things happen. You have a shell that comes from your gun, and you have a bullet that comes out the other end. When the evidence was all gathered, it turned out that all the shells that were found in the apartment came from police weapons, with the possible exception of one. All the bullet holes, the directions of those bullet holes were all coming inside from outside. That is, showed that they were fired by the police.
Patrice Lumumba by the Belgian government with support from the CIA, and Sankara was killed by political rivals with support by France and other Western interests. Assata Shakur is currently exiled from America, living in Cuba, and Mumia Abu-Jamal is currently a political prisoner in America because they're so influential to this philosophy. Further, I would also argue that revolutionary Pan-Africanism has just done the shit. They've done way more with less in America, and more notably in Africa, in terms of actual significant liberation movements. Movements built on this philosophy in Africa have been some of the only successful, sustained liberation movements that the continent has ever seen. While all have eventually ended, sometimes in ugly ways, and almost always as a result of enduring Western interference, African nations such as Ghana, Burkina Faso, and Libya were able to escape colonial rule for extended periods of time in Africa using these principles.
We say that we create our own African personality and identity. We dedicate ourselves not only in the struggle to emancipate all the countries in Africa. Our independence is meaningless unless it is linked up with total reflection of the African continent.
And today, Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger have formed a coalition against neocolonial rule, following Pan-African principles, expelling imperial forces, along with neocolonial rulers who were Africans themselves. In doing that, they've given land back to their people. They've gotten control over their own resources. These were not bloodless stories of liberation, and no revolution or liberation action is perfect. But to be blunt, the other Black radical philosophies mentioned don't have any track record of similar actions to even be critical of.
When we talk of revolution, of course, we mean bloodshed. Either one is non-violent and one's blood is shed, or one retaliates and shed the blood of those who's trying to shed one blood. That is to say, either you be like Dr. Martin Luther King or Jesus Christ, you're willing to have your blood shed, or you be like Lenin, or you be like Mao, or you be like Fidel, or you be like Kim Il-sung, or you be like Sekou Ture, you shed the blood of those who are trying to kill you. But let it be understood that I'm a reasonable man, even though the American press tries to make it appear that not a reasonable man, a very reasonable man. And as a reasonable man, I don't want bloodshed at all, especially my bloodshed. But I want my liberation more than I want anything else. I want my people to be free, and I want humanity to go forward more than I want my very life. Therefore, I understand the necessity of revolution, and I understand the necessity to be prepared for it and to work for it, even though it means bloodshed.
And the reason for the severe repression is that success, which is also connected to its ideological core, which is explicitly leftist, socialist in nature.
No, we're not confused. We are socialists, and not only socialists, we tell you Pan-Africanism is inextricably bound with socialism. One cannot be a Pan-Africanist unless one is a socialist. This point must be properly understood.
There are various schools of leftist thought that permeate through pretty much the entire radical tradition, but all were anti-capitalist and people-powered centered. And that has always been a major threat to white supremacy, arguably the only legitimate threat white supremacy has had worldwide.
This is how with Niger and Mali and Burkina Faso, and the efforts to make, they're a confederation now, but the efforts to move towards a federation and then eventually pull in other states, that even being a conversation that's now
a big deal.
Speaks to the potential of this actual political objective. It has always, revolutionary Pan-Africanism has always been a political objective, right? So we're looking at the actual potential of this actually occurring. When it comes to material analysis as a direct response to the realities of being internally colonized, imperialism, capitalism, those are things that revolutionary Pan-Africanism speaks to and seeks to resolve. Even to the questions of women, even to the questions of gender nonconformity, right? Because what does it mean for the masses of people? What does it mean for the workers? And how do you build from the bottom up? And what does that transformative society look like? And that has been what since the Fifth Pan-African Congress, that has been the conversation and the direction around Pan-Africanism as a political objective. There's different takes on it, obviously, but if we are speaking of Nkrumah, if we are speaking of Sekou Touré, if we are even talking about Kwame Ture, they are speaking about revolutionary Pan-Africanism in one united socialist Africa.
You had put me on to Martin Delaney, and one of the things that I noticed about Delaney is that, and I said this, is that not only is he the first person of his stature that we know of to articulate what we would call Black nationalism, but also Afro-pessimism. Because his whole thing was that there's no place for us in white supremacist America. And I say that to make the point that it's indicative of just how deep anti-Blackness goes in mainstream academic thought, that we don't engage with these alternative schools of black thought unless and until it's to deride it. Right? Because wasn't nobody talking about Hoteps until the white folks at least weren't talking about Hoteps until Kyrie and Ye and all them. Y'all ain't even know what that was. And we've been this been around for at least 40 years. The way that the Hoteps that y'all know have been around for at least 40 years. And if we're going to keep it a buck, they've been around since the turn of the 20th century with the Moors and all of that. But because it is Black and because whiteness just has this inherent need to deride or to diminish anything that challenges it, right? Now we have an opportunity to jump on it. We have a sacrificial lamb, so to speak. Us Black academics, Black and intelligentsia, I guess that's the word. Our failure is in that we basically go along with the white folks. We don't really prop up these schools of thought unless and until the white folks say it's okay, that it's worth our engagement. But until then, we find the way to, for lack of better phrasing, appropriate Marx, appropriate Gramsci, appropriate all of that, and interpret it through a Black lens when we have literally a century plus of Black nationalist thought that we can refer to.
This leftist course also greatly separates revolutionary Pan-Africanism from Afrocentricity and Afrocentrism, and neither school of thought really takes an explicit political position other than being opposed to a Eurocentric worldview.
The political philosophy of socialism might have something to contribute to some form of African communalism that we may not yet have explored. However, it is fundamental that Pan-Africanism not be viewed simply as an objective without a vehicle. It has to have an intellectual content.
Both Afrocentricity and Afrocentrism aren't not necessarily pro-capitalism, but they're very open to it and very amenable to being influenced by it, which is probably why these ideologies are far less targeted and far more popular in pop culture, because to allow the imagery and energy and philosophy of revolutionary Pan-Africanism to take hold in Black people's political consciousness would genuinely be dangerous to the system. So let's get into Afrocentricity. Afrocentricity has most of the same influences as Pan-Africanism. Again, Garvey, Du Bois, Malcolm X, etc. But then there's also more modern figures like Marimba Ani, John Henrik Clarke.
The most tragic destruction of African culture was the destruction of the African culture brought to these shores, brought to American shores. Now, the first thing they did was to forbid the drum, forbid all African ceremonies, forbid African ornaments, literally to destroy a people in such a manner that they had to be remade in an American image.
Politically speaking, while radical in its overall scope, Afrocentricity is less concerned with an explicit political ideology other than centering Africans at whatever ideology might come out of that work. Hence, some of its influences, such as Garvey being explicitly pro-capitalist. Garvey, ironically, is called the father of Pan-Africanism, but true Garveyites will often want to separate him from Pan-Africanism because he was so capitalist and Pan-Africanism was not. Instead, Afrocentricity is most interested in how Black people view themselves, how they interpret the world around them, and how they might organize around that interpretation and those views. Ama Mazama, a student of arguably the father of modern Afrocentricity, Molefi Asante, states the following in her essay, The Afrocentric Paradigm.
Afrocentricity contends that our main problem as African people is our usually unconscious adoption of the Western worldview and perspective and their attendant conceptual frameworks. The list of those ideas and theories that have invaded our lives as normal, natural, or even worse, ideal is infinite. How many of us have really paused to seriously examine and challenge such ideas as development, planning, progress, the need for democracy, and the nation state as the best form of political and social organization, to name only a few? Our failure to recognize the roots of such ideas in the European cultural ethos has led us, willingly or unwillingly, to agree to footnote status in the white man's book. We thus find ourselves relegated to the periphery, the margin of the European experience. To use Molefi Asante's terms, spectators of a show that defines us from without. In other words, and to use Afrocentric terminology again, we do not exist on our own terms, but on borrowed European ones.
When I see and hear this definition, I understand why this was popular, because it makes so much sense to a lot of Black people, especially Black folks with a certain level of education and social mobility. However, while the core features of Afrocentricity are very radical, I'd argue that they aren't that revolutionary in that they don't threaten power in any meaningful way. There's a great debate between the aforementioned Molefi Asante, the Afrocentrist, and Kwame Ture, the Pan-Africanist, in 1996, where they both seek to extol the virtues of these two philosophies. When I watch this, I have to admit that Ture does not give his best performance compared to other things I've seen of him. He doesn't speak with the incisive wit and clarity that made him such a prominent figure. He still has some great moments, but is not his best showing. This is partially because in 1996 is when Ture is first diagnosed with colon cancer, which he would succumb to 2 years later. And this entire time, Ture has been independently working and speaking about Pan-Africanism. Meanwhile, Asante was a highly sought after and prominent academic working at Temple University, and unlike Ture, he is not burdened for advocating for socialism in the mid-90s, which by then the idea of any leftist thought had been so erased from the public consciousness, it almost sounds jarring to hear him talk about it in a modern sense.
If you're anti-capitalist, then you must be socialist. Capitalism cannot unite Africa. Africa has to be united by socialism. Now, there's a lot of confusion here on this question of capitalism and socialism. Just recently, a young man said to me, but socialism died. I said, yeah, hear about it. I said, I missed the funeral.
And you see that often in the way people respond to him. It's almost like they're humoring the idea of socialism, knowing that it'll never take it seriously.
And it's plausible in ways that I wish I could get my brother Kwame Ture to understand that I believe in Pan-Africanism, and I think that it is possible that the political philosophy of socialism might have something to contribute to some form of African communalism that we may not yet have explored. However,
and this is because at this time, upwardly mobile Black folks are seeing results of their work, results that include my parents. My parents are both college educated and both participated in Afrocentric spaces throughout their lives. I have a lot of memories of being immersed in this world as a child, some fond, Some not so much. We'll get to that later. I asked my dad once why more people like him didn't fall in line with Ture back during the Black Power movement, and his response was pretty simple. Niggas was tired of being broke. There was no ideological barrier on the side of Afrocentricity for seeking out all the things that capitalism provides for people. But you can still have that sense of individual and cultural identity apart from Eurocentrism, while embracing some of the elements that American exceptionalism and Americana mythos might provide you. You can see yourself within the structure, but apart from it at the same time.
Chosen out of the white mainstream constitute a veritable society within a society, largely paralleling but separate from the various levels of social structure found among whites. This World of Astoria Debutante Cotillion, given semi-annually by the New York chapter of a leading Negro women's club called the Girlfriends, is virtually identical to those held here by white groups, save for color.
Whereas Pan-Africanism wants the structure to die. In my assessment, Afrocentricity is the guiding ideal of reimagining Blackness, or more appropriately, Africanness, from being a glitch into being a feature, to steal some nerdy terminology. A lifetime of being the other in white spaces, which is something that pretty much all Black people feel on some level, even if they don't understand it. Being taught from white authored history books and being influenced by white ran media instills in most Black people a sense of inferiority and otherness that is almost impossible to shake. And even in well-developed, predominantly Black nations such as the Caribbean and parts of Africa, the scars of colonialism and Western influences still remain and have a similar effect.
For the past 6 years, the man most responsible for government policy in Kenya is the country's first elected president, Mzee Jomo Kenyatta. Emerging from the Mau Mau Revolution of the 1950s, Kenyatta, mostly through the force of his own personality, has held the country together despite pressing tribal animosities and growing disparity between haves and have-nots. Here, celebrating Kenya's 6th year of independence, Kenyatta states his desire to maintain an economic system of free enterprise and a multiracial society. The retention of many former colonialists as advisors is a major problem in Kenya. Because of the heavy investment prior to independence of the Europeans, or Muzungus as they are called in Swahili, total social development of the African is held back.
Afrocentricity greatly counteracts this, and it does this specifically by being a rigorous theoretical framework for understanding the world and history from an African-centered perspective. And this is important because this, according to Molefi Asante, is what separates Afrocentricity from Afrocentrism, which as we move becomes a very important distinction.
By way of distinction, Afrocentricity should not be confused with the variant Afrocentrism. The term Afrocentrism was first used by the opponents of Afrocentricity, who in their zeal saw it as an obverse of Eurocentrism. The adjective Afrocentric in the academic literature always referred to Afrocentricity. However, the use of Afrocentrism reflected a negation of the idea of Afrocentricity as a positive and progressive paradigm. The aim was to assign religious signification to the idea of African-centeredness. However, it has come to refer to a broad cultural movement of the late 20th century that has a set of philosophical, political, and artistic ideas which provides the basis for the musical, sartorial, and aesthetic dimensions of the African personality. On the other hand, Afrocentricity, as I have previously defined it, is a theory of agency. That is, the idea that African people must be viewed and view themselves as agents rather than spectators to historical revolution and change. To this end, Afrocentricity seeks to examine every aspect of the subject place of Africans in historical, literary, architectural, ethical, philosophical, economic, and political life.
So in summary, what I see here from Molefi is him not wanting Afrocentricity, the academic theoretical framework that's been tested and has empirical, rigorous study behind it and is approved by academia, to be mistaken for Afrocentrism, a broad and decentralized cultural movement of Black people connected to the continent of Africa. And this is something I just myself learned as a big factor in the scope of this video. To the layman, Afrocentricity and Afrocentrism are pretty much identical, especially especially aesthetically. However, the problem seems to be that as Afrocentricity became more and more popular and connected to establishment ways of life in America, because of people like the aforementioned Ron Karenga, there was a loosening on the empiricism and the historical accuracy. There was a significant introduction of myth and religious framings of African thought and culture, and most significantly, a melding of a variety of alternative Black spaces and philosophies under the banner of the academically validated Afrocentricity. Thus, as Asante states here, Afrocentricity had to separate itself as a true field of thought and academic study from that wider cultural, somewhat religious world. Because, to put it simply, shit got really weird and wild in that Afrocentrism space. If you are part of the conscious community, if you use woke before 2010, you probably know what I'm getting at, because what I'm getting at is a lot of the things that we consider today Hotep. So just to summarize, we have revolutionary Pan-Africanism, explicitly leftist, field-tested with legit accomplishments in the African continent of freeing nations from colonial rule. We have Afrocentricity, an academic cultural movement that is empirical and framed and refined within academia. And then we have Afrocentrism, which pulls a lot from all of these things, but because it's a broad cultural, quasi-religious movement, anything goes. Afrocentrism is a broad concept and Black cultural movement, but rogue elements within it are responsible for what we think of as the Hotep today. But even then, just identifying this broad school of thought, we haven't really scratched the surface on how regressive and reactionary ideology found a home in this school of thought that was ostensibly healthy for all Black people. Like, you don't go from healthy food and cowrie shells and drum circles to single Black mothers are ruining the Black community because they're raising their sons to be gay. That's not a straight line. There's still something in between here, or really kind of vaguely attached the entire time, that emerges in that 2010 period that makes sense of really the whole of the problem.
It's a place that granted our request for a visit inside the secured gate, allowed us to watch the workers build new ceremonial structures, allowed us to listen close up to the continuous chant broadcast from a speaker bank at the top of one of the pyramids.
It's an Egyptian theme park.
This is a theme park?
An Egyptian theme park.
Now, there's some people who think this is a cult.
Well, there's two ways to look at it. We don't happen to have a religious belief. You follow what I'm saying? Now, on the other hand, culture.
The self-proclaimed son of God was arrested on Wednesday, charged with racketeering and given the orders to kill 14 people. His attorney, Ellis Rubin, told a federal magistrate here that Yahweh Ben Yahweh is the same person mentioned in the grand jury indictment. Until now, he refused to give his name. By identifying himself, it means he will automatically be sent back to Miami for a bond hearing and to face trial.
Sex house of horror.
He would abuse me in front of the women.
And it came crashing down when police caught up with Eligio Bishop. They call him Nature Boy.
I had to willingly engage in these sexual activities to keep myself safe.
Victims of his alleged sex cult are speaking out.
I was still strangled on multiple occasions.
They say once accepted, Bishop forced women to have sex with him. You had to change your name and give up all your money.
Okay. I think maybe I'm starting to see my place in all this. Clearly, I am here as the comedic relief in order to break up the heaviness of these sections, which is fine. So some might say it's a waste of time for one of YouTube's most prominent video essayists, but hey, I mean, at least now, surely I'm gonna get invited to the cookout. I'm sorry, what? The cookout's been closed since 2016?
So let's start with the fact that alternative thought spaces in general have always attracted charlatans and grifters and weirdos and cult leaders and abusers, Black or otherwise. Lil Bill goes into all of this a bit more on his video. Again, you should watch that. But he stops toward the modern era, which is where I want to begin here, because as we get into the 70s and 80s, we see in the aftermath of the Black Power movement an explosion of Afrocentrist practices and imagery in America. This is why I disagree with the previous statement from Molefi Asante saying that Afrocentricity predates Afrocentrism in a sense, because while like it's obviously not an explicit thing that's academic, so much of what Afrocentricity and Afrocentrism becomes starts well before Molefi coins that term, well before it becomes an academic concept. More importantly, if you want to map the most negative elements of this movement and like wave of thought on Afrocentrism, then you're going back 1890s to like Noble Drew Ali to show early elements of what we call today Hoteps doing Hotep type shit and hurting people in the process. Now, when you talk about a Noble Drew Ali, which is again like early 1900s, the aesthetics are different. Nobody's called themselves Africans. In fact, there's often an overt effort to separate themselves from Africa, but other aspects of what we would come to associate with Hotepery are definitely there. Unempirical and fantastical claims about Black people and religion, a desire to mythologize Blackness or separate Black people from others through some divine philosophical meaning or like framework, passive and sometimes often really overt anti-Semitism, misogyny, and of course lots of scamming along with straight up cults. All that's happening under the Afrocentric umbrella. Air quote strong there because it's not that yet. But all that's happening back in the 1900s. In the 60s, these fringe elements where people are not Africans, they're Israelites or Muslims or aliens or some shit. When the Black Power movement becomes popular, the ideologies aren't so dissimilar. And so this group of mostly weirdos and grifters begin to emulate this group who had actual cultural cachet. And then you add into it legit like civil rights movement activity, legit Black political philosophy, and you get some more aggressive and nationalistic rhetoric. And then suddenly it's all kind of mixed together. And it becomes difficult to parse out, as it still is today, because everyone was purporting to be in service of Black liberation. Thus, everyone who's willing to do work is welcome in the club. And this is where things get complex and kind of hard to parse out.
Because even to the point of the nation, right? For me, my frustration has always been like, well, I get it, because they are problematic in some aspects, right? But they also, it's a national organization that has local organizing, right?
Yeah. I'm from Chicago.
What is the local relationship with the NOI? And I think when you build those local relationships, you see that it's distinct from the national kind of over it, because you can make concessions and you can struggle with this is what we will allow and won't allow. And then if it comes to that point, I always tell people, like, out-organize them. That's how you get rid of people. Because obviously they're still around because there's a need. And they're able to sustain themselves, right? They pay for the funerals. They show up,
They show up. Like
you can't detach that. You know what I'm saying? So for me, you have to kind of learn how to just deal with that. Like the criticisms are valid, right? And it's not to say don't criticize, but then it can't be because you criticize, you just cut off, you don't engage at all. Right. Because then you just leave reactionaries to just grow, right? There's no pushback against that at all, or at least no visible pushback. So they could just fester and flounder and just continue to grow.
And then they shape the education, and then suddenly all these other things that are very important get lost.
Like even growing up in church, there was always like this, I don't want to say reverence, but like respect for, if not the ideology, at least what they represented, right? Who else out here we got that's really saying Black power like that? All we got is Cliff Huxtable, right? We got Jesse Jackson and Al Sharpton, we got
Obama.
And eventually, right. What all we got is a bunch of feds telling us to, play nice with the white folks. We ain't really got nobody that's even if you wanna do church, we ain't got no Jeremiah Wrights, or the Jeremiah Wrights, when you hear about them, now they're getting crucified in the media, right? So it's like beggars can't be choosers, right? We gotta have somebody that's going to voice that radical Black politics.
The thing that's always made Hotepery hard to talk about is that there's always significant kernels of value in movements that are sometimes accused of or legitimately Hotep adjacent. All of these groups, Hoteps or not, have been highly capable of amassing resources and taking action in service of black people. The Nation of Islam, which if you know me, you know I'm not a fan of, which I believe at its core is a cult, is still one of the most valuable organizations for black progress in existence in American history. And while its most visible aspects at the top that people know about have a lot of problematic elements to contend with, at smaller local levels, it's undeniable that they have done serious, legitimate work for black people in America and worldwide. The same can't be said for a lot of these other fringe elements and groups, whether they be legitimate and sound in their philosophy and practices or Hotep nonsense. The NOI illustrates that various schools of thought that we associate with negative Hotep imagery have also done so much work and thus have earned a level of investment, trust, and legitimacy in black spaces. And rightfully so. It's just unfortunate that this has made it much harder to identify bad faith actors moving in between the cracks. And this also makes us understand why it's attractive to a lot of black people. There's always going to be a significant population of people looking for other ways of thinking and being apart from whatever the dominant ideology is, especially if you are black and you're constantly faced with anti-blackness. And these folks tend to be runaways and outcasts and people who are othered, even maybe within community, people who don't fit in or are forced out for whatever reason. They're going to look for a haven and for people that can make them feel like they belong, or more conspicuously, they'll be looking for purpose and something to define them when the overarching culture that they are born out of seeks to exclude them. The Panthers themselves were greatly made up of street kids and former gangsters, people that were somewhat on the fringes of society. And that is typical for a lot of revolutionary entities throughout history. It's seldom those who come from within an oppressive structure who tear it down. So attach all of that stuff that we know are universal, like sociological phenomena, no matter what your race is, to being black in America. And of course, you see how it's appealing. Someone says you're not black, you're Egyptian or an Israelite. You're not a nigga or a bitch, you're a king or a queen. There's an appeal there that is hard to get people away from.
As an oppressed man, I'm a man, I don't want to accept that I'm oppressed by bureaucrats, that my life is controlled. My life expectancy has been shortened. My ability to navigate society is controlled by bureaucrats, policymakers. Now, if I could say there's some secret cabal, some supernatural force, some demonic entity or demonic coven, or some alien reptiles, Illuminati, Masonic, and not only are these...
Don't forget the Jews.
Right. Oh, yeah, of course. But we're the real Jews. So
we're also the real Jews. That's true.
Right. We're the real Jews, and we're oppressed by it. But we'd hate to think the devaluing of black life and brutality against black people is just the status quo. It's a day at work. We'd like to think, it's a part of some grander scheme.
Lil Bill says something like, there's no greater zealot than a new convert. Have you ever tried to talk to a new convert at anything? Good luck with that. So all this sets the stage for the 70s and the 80s. There's countless forming, dissolving, and reforming of different alternative black spaces, some more prominent than others, some more effectual, some more righteous, some more toxic, all very black and very much in that radical tradition in some format. This is also a volatile time for racist violence, uprisings, and riots in urban centers across the country, such as Watts, Detroit, Harlem. And that's when we do see the federal government start to pay more attention, both through legitimate efforts to address the issues that black people were presenting, such as the Civil Rights Bill and the study of the Kerner Commission, but also through repression and counterintelligence from the FBI and the CIA. J. Edgar Hoover's reign as the chief of the CIA sees an unprecedented era of government repression of any threat to the American status quo, with a significant thirst for attacking the left and black radicalism of any form. So remember, the most valued, in my opinion, elements of this political radical space, revolutionary Pan-Africanism, they're targeted, removed off the board early before anyone really gets a chance to be influential. And all you're left with is Afrocentrism and Afrocentrists, who themselves are much more amenable to the status quo and begin to become more influential and also create a safer haven for weirdos and quacks. Weirdos and quacks like religious cult leaders such as Yahweh Ben Yahweh and Malachi York, both founding quasi-Afrocentric congregations around things like African mysticism and Egyptology and science fiction, which was a popular trope for many a cult leader at the time, regardless of your race, the most prominent again being the Nation of Islam's earliest years. And it's not hard to draw a line between Noble Drew Ali, the earliest days of NOI, the Hebrew Israelites, Yahweh Ben Yahweh, and Malachi York, and whoever comes next. I know there's a bunch of people. There's a guy that called Nature Boy that was here in Georgia. Georgia has a lot of cults. It's weird that way. Yahweh Ben Yahweh started his cult in the late 70s, and by the 90s, he had been convicted of several scamming charges, but that would then spiral into murder conspiracy charges for him and members of his cult. Supposedly, he had people like doing hits all across the country. Somebody got beheaded. He went to jail for 10 years and then died after he was released in 2007. Malachi York went under a variety of names and permutations for his cult, eventually building, again, a massive compound in Georgia. York was convicted of over 100 counts of sexual abuse and child sexual assault, which was a part of his religious doctrine somehow. He is still alive today, and his teachings, sadly, are still circulating Afrocentrism spaces. But these types of stories are outliers and don't look all that different from non-Black cults that have existed all over the world for generations. What I think really primes Afrocentrism for becoming Hotepery are the compromised figures who will become leaders in non-religious groups. These figures would gain followers and nominal wealth and power through a lot of big fancy talk and then proceed to do little to nothing to make good on their strong rhetoric, priming the whole ideology for mockery and ridicule in the Black community. This non-religious but populist group is really where the core of the problem exists, in my opinion, because when you have the fact that, again, a lot of these groups were valuable on some level, you have also their connection to a Black bourgeois-like class that was emerging in the 70s and 80s, which meant that they were imbued with a lot of power and responsibility and almost no ability for people to check and like oversee what they were actually doing. And then all of this is fighting against, counterintelligence and, CIA and FBI resistance that makes it hard to parse out what's really going on. Because Afrocentrism is amenable to capitalism, and this is stuff that people had to study in school a lot of times, you saw an emergence of people that would talk a good game but didn't have the class consciousness to back it up. So these figures will ultimately be loyal to the class strata that they were in and highly hesitant to do anything meaningful to threaten it. But the rhetoric will make them powerful and prominent regardless, which also coincides with the fact that a lot of these various permutations of Afrocentrism are greatly boys' clubs. When you think of the problematic Hotep leader figure, you're almost always thinking of a man, because this space was a great venue for charismatic, well-spoken Black men to be seen as leaders and prophets, to be powerful figureheads who, of course, would attract a bevy of female admirers. This allowed them to access a performance of masculinity and manhood that might be harder to get in other walks of life as a Black man. To be honest, in my personal experience, all the problematic Hoteps I've ever known in my life were at their core womenizers. Like, that's why they got into it in the first place.
Even if I didn't know the language, I understood the confidence level that people had and how it affected the way they interacted with the opposite sex. Sure. So when I came back home, I started to use that nonverbal language in relationships, and I came up with some of my own strategies, and I wrote the book, The Art of Mackin', and it became an instant bestseller.
Which is also ironic because the joke about Hoteps being like exclusively with white women is also a thing. Like, that's not just something that happens on TV. If you know, you know. So this lent itself to a lot of rampant misogyny and misogynoir in these spaces. And while misogyny has always been a problem in many a political movement, it was at least directly addressed in some elements of the Black Power movement. But in Afrocentrism and Afrocentricity, there was an overbearing amount of misogyny, womanizing, and abuse toward women, partially because there was a religious element to it that validated it, and it was attracting, again, those vulnerable people looking for someone to follow, looking for a strong man to lead.
All that was happening at that time, right? And Hotep was kind of being thrown around to talk mostly about men who you didn't want to date, you didn't want to engage with. Because also at this time, like, the internet is a crazy, like, I mean, the internet's always, is not crazy right now.
Right.
But at that time, like, Hidden Colors, Tommy Sotomayor, Watkins, like, YouTube is a wasteland of Black men who are like commanding some sort of audience.
Yeah, pseudo-intellectual.
And really weaponizing it against Black women.
Yeah.
And so Hotep kind of becomes a way to dismiss men who are very anti-Black women in their politic while supposedly being very pro-Black people. Watching a film where they literally kind of draw this line from single mothers to the uptick of young gay men, that men are becoming gay because they are raised in single female-led households. Like, Do we hear ourselves?
And I think so I guess what I'm trying to get at is I think we do. But that doesn't mean that women weren't prominent and, supportive of the movement, especially when it came time to voice their support for patriarchy. Most notably is probably the work of Shahrazad Ali, who's been a staple of Afrocentric Hotep spectacles since the late 80s after publishing her book, The Black Man's Guide to Understanding the Black Woman. In it, she repeats all of the greatest hits of Hotep misogyny about Black women being too loud and aggressive, and men shouldn't have to be faithful to one woman, and even advocating for violence against them as a form of discipline. Somewhat less heinous but still very problematic is the work of Dr. Frances Cress Welsing, the writer of the ISIS Papers. Welsing was a medical doctor turned Afrocentrist who made compelling but greatly unempirical arguments about Black and white psychology. She's also greatly responsible for the gay agenda myth becoming popular in Afrocentrism. You may know her from this amazing moment in Buck Breaking, Tariq Nasheed's homophobic slavery documentary.
I say the pants sagging down is just subconscious invitation for homosexuality. You see, it's revealing the buttocks. So you step out of the pants, you're gonna put on a dress.
I did a video on it. I almost don't want y'all to watch it because there are some problems with that video. But this is why I knew I had it as a video essayist. But don't think that petite bourgeois Negroes had the corner market on Hotep Afrocentric nonsense, because street level, lumpen proletariat Black folks were no less charismatic and appealing and had just as wide of reach and arguably a more population of people to grift from. Many a 5%er or NOI member would first find those belief systems in prison as a venue for escaping street life, which again brings us back to the difficult paradox, because while these belief systems are problematic on many fronts, it was still valuable for correcting the trajectory of many a Black man. There's many a Black man that is alive today or not in jail today because they found the NOI or something else while in prison, and it saved their lives. Radical philosophies born out of prison, whether Hotep adjacent or not, are extremely valuable. George Jackson, one of the most influential figures in Black radical politics, found Marxism in prison. Current political prisoner Mumia Abu-Jamal regularly writes and speaks about Black liberation from prison. So again, you see how the lines get blurred, and it becomes more important that people are able to see through that blurriness to figure out what teachings and philosophies are actually adding value and which ones are creating maybe unintended consequences. But what you hopefully get from this section is that the concept of Hotep is not all one thing. It's complicated in its problems, and it doesn't allow for one singularly easy image as a villain or something to point to as the source of the problem. And this brings me back to Maulana Karenga.
I still see Karenga Claus as an asset of the system. That Kawaida and even Kwanzaa, I was having to tell people Kwanzaa is not a revolutionary holiday. It's very appropriate that you can walk in Target and see a Kwanzaa section. It's very appropriate that you can go buy Hallmark cards with Kwanzaa themes, or you can look at any average sitcom on its Christmas special and they'll drop a line about Kwanzaa, because Kwanzaa is not revolutionary. If you look at the Nguzo Saba, it's not about challenging the status quo. It's about allowing Black people to have a dignified place within the genocidal, omnicidal status quo.
Now, that allegation continues to circulate. How do you respond to that allegation?
The way I've always, I'm not guilty of the state's charges. I've always maintained my innocence. I'm a victim and a survivor of the COINTELPRO.
Jesus. Feek told me that if he hits 1 million subscribers, he's going to make a video about the prolific and deeply controversial filmmaker Tyler Perry. Did you know that Ireland actually has its own version of Medea with all the same problems? It's called Mrs. Brown's Boys, and I hate this character probably as much as Feek hates Tyler Perry. Even Tyler Perry himself recognized these similarities and actually made Agnes Brown a prominent character in his movie Medea Homecoming.
Hold on, it's knickers. It's underwear.
Yes, it's knickers. These are knickers.
This is deeply embarrassing for us all, but it has me thinking about the fact that there's so many similarities between the Irish and Black America. In fact, to wrap up this video, I think now would be an appropriate time to talk about Ireland's long history of anti-colonial resistance and how that resulted in the world's first piece of non-Japanese hentai.
A lot of this section pulls from the book Fighting for Us by Scott Brown, which is a long-form documentation and analysis of Karenga's US organization and his career. Just want to point that out so any of the will actuallys don't come from me about plagiarism. I am going to talk a lot about this book here. For me, if you want to understand Hoteps, you really just need to understand Ron Karenga. In his career, we see every aspect of the paradox of Afrocentrism and Hotepery. Karenga was an academic getting his bachelor's and master's before beginning as an organizer at UCLA and creating that organization, the US organization, in 1965, also creating Kwanzaa a year later. So almost immediately we see a lot of the factors I just spoken of, because Karenga, once he becomes the leader of this organization, does take on a cult-like air within it as its leader, taking on that name Mulana, which in Swahili means master teacher. Members within the organization take on the militaristic nature that we see in the wider Black Power movement in the 60s. Women are relegated to subordinate status, and patriarchal practices such as polygamy run amok to the point where women seek formal abolishment of the practice within the organization, and it was hard to actually get that done because many women preferred the polygamy. The clashing with the local Panthers is also almost immediate, and Karenga shows a reactionary petite bourgeois regard for the Panthers, who he sees as unorganized and rambunctious, essentially calling them ghetto. At this time, Karenga is presenting his form of Black nationalism and Afrocentrism as a higher way of being than the uninitiated Negroes that don't know any better and really should just get out of the way to let the real leaders lead. He develops a quasi-religious belief system known as Kawaidism, requiring their members to be civilized, unlike the other Black people, as Karenga believed. In his book, Brown writes,
Kawaiists were expected to be polite, calm, disciplined, and intellectual. These attributes, born of an internalization of a new value system, were counterpositioned against the behaviors of Negroes, or African Americans without values.
They took Black nationalism and divorced it from class consciousness. They took Hotep and did to it what the white folks did with woke. I used the argument where Fanon talks about how the lower class, being the most divorced from the I forget exactly how he phrased it, but the dominant ideology of the colonizer, because they can't participate. They don't have the resources to do it. They have the most revolutionary potential of anybody. And then I tie that in with Marcuse, who makes the point that at least as far as capitalist societies, those of us working and above, we don't have the capacity to have that same revolutionary potential because we're still married to the dominant ideology, which is consumption. And so what winds up happening is that a lot of it just comes down to pride. Is we don't want to admit that, the street niggas had it before us.
This sense of elitism is seen through much of Karenga's opinions and movements, that Black people who had not adopted some form of Afrocentric belief and aesthetic were either lost or uncivilized. Even other ostensibly bourgeois traditions like Black literature and the blues were not safe from Karenga's derision. As I read through this book, hearing how he talked about the blues and poetry, it almost sounds like how a lot of Black folks talked about hip hop in the 80s and 90s. They were like, it was appealing, but unrefined, and projected an image of Blackness that held Black people back. A lot of dog whistles there. So it makes sense that Bunchy Carter, who was a street dude turned revolutionary, and the Panthers in general, who were mostly street people turned revolutionary, were not getting along with Karenga in Southern California. Again, Brown writes,
A Black Panther newspaper article's description of Karenga suggested his academic background detracted from his authenticity as a community leader. Karenga is not a street brother. Although he has learned some street tongue just as he learned Swahili, the U.S. organization's internal culture discouraged behaviors and mannerisms attributed to street life, and inspired a common fascination with education out of emulation of its leaders. There was a general perception among U.S. advocates that elements of the party celebrated a lifestyle unfit for revolutionaries.
And this is all the early years before the murder of Bunchy Carter, because after that, it gets much worse for him. It takes a dark turn. Several US members were convicted for the murders, although the alleged gunman went on the run and was never found. This created a specter around Karenga and his organization that would lead to significant mistrust and ostracism from the greater Black organizing community in LA. And it didn't help that, again, Karenga admitted to meeting with Ronald Reagan and the LAPD on several occasions during the 1960s. However, this did not stop Karenga as he continued to work and organize, though impaired from fatigue and allegedly drug abuse. However, the cult of personality around him got a hold of him. Because of a growing paranoia and, again, alleged drug use, Karenga orders the torture of 2 Black women in his organization that he suspects were spies. This torture included burning them with hot pokers, beating them with electric cords and karate tools, a kendo stick probably. These Black women escaped from their torture. Eventually, police are involved, and Karenga and 2 others are convicted of torture and false imprisonment, facing up to 10 years starting in 1971. In his absence, the US organization pretty much folds, but Karenga somehow is able to petition various Black leaders and get an early parole to be freed in 1975. Now, Karenga maintains his innocence despite the direct testimony of the victims, and even calls himself a former political prisoner, which you can see I'm trying to hold back. Trying to hold back laughter, because, yeah. But despite all this, because of whatever connections he had, again, there's lots of claims about who he was actually connected to. Karenga makes his way back to Black national circles, the same ones he had did harm to. Now, he's not accepted by everyone, especially even today. There's plenty of people that never fuck around Karenga. Before his death, John Emmerich Clark, a foundational figure in Afrocentric thought, decried the continued presence of Karenga. But despite this, Karenga rebuilds his image, his career. He gets a PhD and then a second PhD before the 1980s are over. And because of Kwanzaa, he becomes one of the most recognizable names in Afrocentricity. Kwanzaa, again, is nationally recognized. It starts getting acceptance and imagery in pop culture. And so none of that stuff from his past seems to be relevant. And to his credit, he's mostly stayed out of trouble. And even with the rise of the right-wing Hotep, rhetoric that got popularized in that 2010s era, he was not a part of that. He stayed away from that, if that's any consolation. I won't tell you how to interpret this part of his history. I tend to often be of the mind that problematic people are capable of doing good things. And I'm sure that's where a lot of people are that look at Karenga's legacy and what he gave to Black culture as a net positive. And many of our favorite theorists and thinkers have very ugly blemishes in their history. This does not change what they contributed. So if you appreciate Kwanzaa and the fact that folks are learning Swahili, I get it. Or you also might think that torturing Black women and working with the feds resulting in the murder of a Black Panther should automatically and eternally disqualify you from elder status. You decide.
Yeah. And I think we should incentivize solidarity and sanction disloyalty and predation within our community. There are so many people that have done immeasurable harm to us that are still able to just navigate our communities with no consequences. From Karenga Claus to Farrakhan, man. Yeah. And until we have internal accountability and internal standards, and it just hurts my heart when Kanye will say something, disrespect our ancestors. Slavery was a choice to say some shit, and then just go on about his life. But then he'll say something anti-Semitic. And the Jewish community will step to him, and then Black people start saying, well, when he disrespected us, nothing happened to him. What do you want from these people who don't take disrespect? Do we want them to suffer the indignities as we do, or do we want them to act on our behalf to impose consequences? What are you asking of these people when you say, when he disrespected Black women, when he disrespected our ancestors, when he disrespected our community, nothing happened? Then he said something against that offended the Jewish community, or he said something against the Irish or the Polish, or used some slur against women. All of a sudden, he's Me Too, and he can't work anymore. What about us? As if we don't have the ability to impose those consequences amongst ourselves.
But whatever you decide, understand that this is what it is. This is how Hotep exists, in this nebulous space between, no, there's some serious stuff here, and oh my fucking God, we cannot associate with you at all, go away. The Afrocentrism that I grew up under and around in Chicago was greatly influenced by Karinga, and it showed. I'm probably a feminist today because I remembered how some of the men around me in these spaces would treat women, specifically my own mother, a very successful, well-educated single mother. Like, I would have dudes selling smell good oils and be telling her that she needed to give up her job and be submissive so she can get a husband and fulfill her natural role as a black woman. I remember vividly the doublespeak. I remember the hypocrisy. I remember the people that were all talk, the people that were quick to say the wildest thing ever, and when people needed help, never show up. And I think the value I have is that I experienced this as a young person, as a child, and I grew up around it. So I recognize the bullshit and the flawed nonsense in the rise of Hotepery from jump. But at the same time, I also remember many an African festival. I remember how much I loved African dancing and how much I loved learning how to play the drums to accompany the dance. My mother loved to dance, and today she sadly suffers from Alzheimer's and is a shell of herself. But if I put on some fela, if I put on some African drums, she turns back into her old self. My father wasn't around much when I was young, and it was often the best elder man in this space who watched over me, taught me how to play those drums, taught me karate even. In my personal life, I've seen Fruit of Islam clean up the streets. I've seen them clean up the streets both literally and symbolically, if you catch my drift. My tutors were Afrocentrists, my mentors followed Warfdi Muhammad, and I wasn't the only one, but I was also a lucky one because I witnessed harm but was never in directly harm's way from some of the more toxic figures, the ones that influenced what we saw spill out online in the 2010s. Karinga is a microcosm of that problem, of that complexity of what the Hotep, the Ankh rite, or whatever you want to call it, shows us, and why it's not something that's just going to easily go away if we ridicule and ignore it. Because when we do that, we fail to recognize why it's effective and appealing in the first place. And I don't think it's a coincidence that a man with known ties to the government would become so influential in this radical framework of political thought across the country. There's a reason why Ron Karinga got the national holiday and not John Henrik Clark, just as why Umar Johnson is able to claim that he represents Pan-Africanism with minimal pushback, or that somehow these politics have become something to represent the uninformed ramblings of Kanye West and Kyrie Irving. It's a combination of, social media and modern media serving the interests of the capitalists and white supremacy, but it's also the way that this media manipulates us into engaging uncritically with rage bait. It's people having an aversion to more complex and meaningful material, both on and offline, and not being willing to recognize that they may not know as much as they think they know, they may not be as smart as they think they are, and they definitely aren't as down as they wish they could be, which comes back to all of us watching and me speaking. It's time to push back against the charlatans that promulgate the worst version of this imagery, but it's also time to reclaim the ideology as it originated. I'm not saying to go around calling yourselves Hotep or to use the term as it was meant to be, or that you can't continue to ridicule goofy guys doing goofy shit. But I think a little reading and studying goes a long way in educating yourself about what you're actually talking about. Because when you do that, when you hear Hotep Jesus call some nonsense pro-black or African, you can call him out on the fact that the people that actually promulgated that philosophy don't agree with him, and that he's pulling that low-key from his ass. Now, I'm not advocating arguing with your Hotep cousins and brothers-in-laws and whomever else, because if you've ever argued with a Hotep, you're doing it basically for fun because you know you're not changing their mind. But at least you can recognize legitimacy where it exists, and you can empower the things that somewhat engage with that ideology to hopefully subsume it, if that makes sense. Instead of memeing them to death when we know memes don't work, what we should be doing is out organizing, out educating, outclassing them in the streets, making it so that the appeal of whatever weird version of these politics might be present in a given area can't compete with the fact that real people doing real shit are taking up all the space. Yeah, so that's all I have for this one, y'all. Please, 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 if you appreciate videos like this, because videos like this do not have the buzz of Drake or Diddy to make them go viral, please check out my Patreon to make sure you support me as a creator so I can keep making stuff like this on occasion. Also, one of the biggest supporters of me is my streaming service, Nebula. Here's more info about them. Final thing before you go. I've actually been working on some things in the background, and one of them will hopefully be my own full-fledged documentary on the concept of whiteness. It's not ready for the big time yet, but a proof of concept was made for it late last year. Talking to White People is a short documentary film, but it packs a punch as I talk to some of the most significant white creators across the YouTube landscape with a variety of ideological and political positions, but who all have in common the fact that they're technically white. But what does that even mean? It's hopefully the beginnings of my first big project on my streaming service, Nebula. For those who don't know, Nebula is the independent streaming service created by YouTubers like me to be a home away from YouTube. Videos like the one you just watched, all about deep lore and black history, are not typically super successful on YouTube. But in case you haven't been following me for a while, I've been very successful at numerous videos like this because I have the support of Nebula. They have been instrumental in supporting me as I built this channel over the years, and it's not just me, it's tons of other very talented creators. And I'd argue it's some of the most talented and forward-thinking creators on YouTube right now. And because there's so much talent on the Nebula roster, we have been expanding more and more into original content with bigger and better budgets that you can't see anywhere else. On developing full-fledged documentary series like Tom Nicholas's documentary Boomers, which looks at the effects on how an aging population is low-key ruining the world right now, or more light stuff like the travel reality show The Getaway, featuring friend of the channel Foreign Man in a Foreign Land. And now you can add Talking to White People to the list of great things only on Nebula. At some point, my goal is to turn that short into a full film or even a series, but I can only do that with your help. Nebula is independent. We are not owned by Google or any other tech company. Everything we make is produced in-house and funded directly to support from viewers. This is why you're seeing this ad read, because we need you to help our vision come true. Please sign up using my link in the description. You'll be supporting the growth of not just my channel, but of creators like me to continue to grow as creators and bring you the type of things you can't see anywhere else. Thank you so much for watching this video. Thank you to Nebula for sponsoring the video, and peace.